let's open our Bibles to Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12, and we come this morning to a very familiar, but let me just warn you out of the gate, a very sobering passage. This is a portion of Scripture that is always relevant, always applicable, especially here in the West, and because it is, without question, one of those passages that provides a perfect exposition as to the state of the heart. In fact, if you have any kind of background in church, then no doubt you are familiar with these words. Preachers will use this passage to guilt people. Of course, usually when the bank account is starting to dip or a building project needs to happen. But the goal of our Lord here is something far more serious and far more eternal. This is a passage that has everything to do with the state of your eternal life. In fact, this is one of the most instructive passages in all of Scripture, I think, warning us as to the importance of living our lives with an eternal perspective. In fact, the older that I become and the longer that I pastor, the more I realize that there are many people just sort of floating through life, just sort of aimlessly drifting from one moment to the next, from one goal or pursuit to the next, certainly from one pleasure to the next, but with zero regard as to how much their life is truly, as James writes in his epistle, like a vapor, which is here today and gone tomorrow. That is something that is true not only for unbelievers who just, again, sort of exist in this world, but with no real thought as to the purpose of their life, no thought to why they exist, no thought to the ultimate reality and the reason for why they've been given breath in the first place. They just exist. They meander their way hour by hour and minute by minute, but as they consistently hurl headlong toward that day of their final breath, that final breath which always comes far sooner than any of us care to think about. But what is so sad, again, just as a pastor, is how that is true for many who claim to be a Christian, for many who claim to know the ultimate purpose for life. They spend their days just floating, hopping, no different from the world, from one anxious issue to the next, with very little thought of eternity in mind. And they're so anxious because they're consumed constantly by the here and the now. And the reason that they're so consumed or preoccupied with the fleeting, temporary issues of life is because they've either lost or they've never really developed a deep conviction that life is unbelievably short, but eternity is forever. They might know that intellectually, but they're not controlled by it from a sober conviction. That is to say that how they spend their life and all of the decisions that they make are not controlled by the biblical truth that all of us are going to be required to give an account for how we spend every minute of our life and every resource that God has gifted to us. And so this is a passage that we come to this morning in which the Lord will now teach a very critical lesson for how to orient your life as a Christian in light of eternity, in light of what is to come. And it is so important because the degree, and hear this please, but the degree to which you can keep the inevitability of eternity before your eyes, that is the degree to which you will live an anxious-free, but also fruitful life. Something we're going to develop over the course of this chapter. That is, it will be the degree to which your life will actually count and matter in terms of the ultimate purpose for why you were created. Or to put it negatively, that is the degree then to which you will not waste your life, to quote the famous book. In fact, that will be the point of this entire chapter, again, kicked off by this passage here this morning. And so let me just begin our time here by reading these important words for us. We're going to be in verses 13 through 21. Again, a familiar portion of Scripture, but it is one that I want to so control everything about this church, to control everything about your life. And so here's what Luke records for us under the inspiration of the Spirit. This is God's word to us this morning. Luke writes concerning a man who comes and demands something of Jesus. He says these words, verse 13, "Someone in the crowd said to him, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me.' But he said to him, 'Man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter over you?' Then he said to them, 'Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions.' And he told them a parable, saying, 'The land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?' And then he said, 'This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grains and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. So take your ease and eat and drink and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, for this very night your soul is required of you. And now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself, but is not rich toward God.'" I would venture to say that many of you, if not most of you in this room, spend a lot of your waking hours thinking about money, plotting, planning, strategizing, reasoning to yourself how to get it, how to keep it, how to grow it. Some of you could show me the most intricate of spreadsheets. Some of you could show me the most efficient wealth management and wealth creating systems, models, all the newest strategies and programs to maximize your potential gains. The fact is, a lot of you have a plan. We call it wisdom. We call it being financially wise. As Christians, we like to baptize all of that, and so we say that we're just being, quote, a faithful steward. We call it many things. And maybe that's a good thing, but maybe it's a bad thing. Some of you make an unbelievable amount of money. More money, frankly, than you even know what to do with, though you often find yourself wanting still just a little bit more. In fact, some of you aren't actually creative enough to even know what to do with it. And some of you are creative. In fact, some of you are just downright scholarly in your research, spending your time learning and figuring out how you can maximize and capitalize and securitize all of your money and all of your possessions. And again, maybe that is a good thing, but maybe it's wicked. In fact, one of the issues that Jesus talked most about, if you didn't know, is the issue of money. And because how you think about money, again, either to get it or to keep it or to grow it, is a judicious window into the state of your heart. And why is money a window into your heart? Well, because it has everything to do with what you love, with what you have affection for, with what you sacrifice for. And that is important to understand, because what you most sacrifice for is what you most love. That is true. What you most sacrifice for is what you most love. In fact, as we'll see Jesus say down in verse 34, he says, "Where your treasure is," present tense, right now, where it is, "there your heart will be also." Fact. In fact, that is the central verse of this entire section. If you want to know what you're actually loving and where your heart is this morning, all you have to do is open up your bank app. Where is your money? How do you spend it? Where do you invest it? What are your plans for it? Where is it going? When you see an outflow from your bank account, here's a question. What feels like loss to you, and what feels like gain? What are you right now calling wise? In fact, we live in a time that is growing more and more uncertain. Wars, rumors of wars, inflation, recession, market crashes of almost every single type, stocks, crypto, housing, whatever. The collapse of some very large banks and institutions, all kinds of foreign interference, the price of eggs, cattle farms blowing up, trains derailing, the word nuclear being dropped just about every single day by some very major world leaders. This is a time, frankly, in which panic nearly wholesale is beginning to settle in some unbelievable ways. And so fear is what has come to rule the day. In fact, some of you are very worried and concerned right now. And I understand that. Some of you aren't certain what to do. Others of you on this issue quietly pat yourself on the back because you think that you've hedged well. And so you're right now believing yourself to somehow be safe. You've got some property. You've got guns and security. You've got some investments, and so you're actually believing that your wisdom has somehow secured your future in a fallen, broken world. Others of you might not even know at all what is going on in this world, and so your approach to money is far more immediate. You're controlled not so much by a lust for security and safety, driven by fear, and perhaps just due to some ignorance, because you've never known anything but safety, and so you just assume that it's just going to keep being that way in this country. Rather, you're controlled profoundly by the pursuit of pleasure. And so you want more money, but merely so that you can spend more on self. And so you're pursuing degrees and jobs and promotions and status because all of it is simply the means to more. And if you're a Christian, perhaps you've lied to yourself by saying that your motive is one in which you can set yourself up nicely, but so that you might give it away for the cause of Christ and the cause of the kingdom. But it's just an exercise of self-deception, perhaps. And I say that in love. But because Jesus also says, he who is faithful with little will be faithful with much. In other words, if you're not doing it now, then there's no way you're going to do it when you have, quote, more. And why? Well, because as we're going to see, it is always about the heart. It is always about what you're trusting in and what you're believing. It is never about how much or how little you have. Rather, it is always about the attitude of the heart with what you have. And so what does your bank account say? Where is your money right now going? Or maybe better, where is it not going? Because where it is going or not going is exactly where it'll go or not go when you have more. And if you don't think that that is true for you, then you don't understand the nature of the human heart. Or Jesus was just a liar. This is a passage about investing. And because where you invest is a commentary on what you love. And what you love is a commentary on what you believe. Believe about God, believe about this world, believe about eternity. It's a commentary on what you're believing about the meaning and purpose of your life and how all of it is truly and fundamentally connected to the age to come. And make no mistake, this is not an issue of how much you have, as if having more or less somehow equates to godliness or ungodliness. This is an issue of what you do with what you have. That is the issue. And because the ability to gain wealth or gain status or gain positions of power is always something that God himself determines. Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 19. And so what I want you to understand is that this is not actually a passage at all about money or possessions. It's framed out that way because, again, money and possessions are always a great revealer. Rather, this is a passage about love. This is a passage about what you love. This is a passage about what you're doing with the resources that God has given you for eternal purposes. And what you do with those resources reveals what you love and therefore where your heart is. And as I tell you often, what you love is seen not in what you say, but in the patterns of your life, in the pursuits of your life. What you run after, but most importantly, perhaps, what you sacrifice for. Every single person in this room has been given this morning the gift of life. But understand, life is unbelievably short. In fact, all of you holding these newborn babies this morning, understand that is unbelievably fleeting. It goes so fast. The question provoked in this passage is that when your life is over, and you have to give an account to King Jesus for the gift of your life and the resources that he's equipped you with to make a difference in the world for the kingdom, the question is, in the end, will your life have mattered? Will it have counted for the cause of Christ? That is the question. Or again, to quote the famous book that many of you have read, will your life have been wasted? Because it was frittered away on everything that frankly did not matter. This is a passage about how you spend your days, about how you spend your hours. Because every minute that you're given breath, beloved, make no mistake, is a profound gift. A gift to steward. A profound gift that you must steward well for the sake of Christ. And so all of that is going to be developed in a very significant way as we work through this chapter together. And so this is the topic that we'll think about, Lord willing, for the next several weeks to come, just given the nature of chapter 12. And so my temptation, I want to say everything about everything in this one sermon I can lay to rest. But you have to know that there is much on my heart pastorally as I look at a room that is primarily younger and has so much life and so much potential, Lord willing, to do much for the cause of Christ. But the purpose of the passage here this morning specifically is to establish in our hearts the broader but more fundamental principle that will drive everything else in this chapter. And that is the very important principle of getting an eternal perspective fixed by conviction deep in your heart. That is the issue. And again, because life is short and eternity is forever. And what you do in this life has everything to do with eternity. In fact, again, the only thing that will matter in the end, beloved, is what you did and how you spent your life for Christ. That is all that'll matter. And because everything else, I promise you, is going away. It's going to disappear in the blink of an eye. It's all fleeting. Life, again, to quote James, is but a vapor. Here today and gone tomorrow. It's like the flower that grows in the morning but withers by evening. And all of those burdens right now, which are so consuming your heart, or so capturing your affections, or so filling you up with anxiety, again, will disappear in the blink of an eye. They will not have mattered. But how you spent your life for Christ will. In life, understand, is not primarily made up of just a few larger decisions, though large decisions often set an irreversible course. But life primarily is made up of 1,000 little decisions whose cumulative effect determines the broader outcome of your life. And that is the heart of this passage. It's the 10,000 little decisions that flow from what you love and what you're believing that have everything to do with eternity and whether or not you're wasting your life. And so this is a very simple but straightforward teaching. It is profound, make no mistake, in many ways, but very simple, very straightforward. The Lord does not want us to be confused on this issue. And so let's take a look at the text itself, and it's broken down very simply. For those of you who like notes, you have here in verses 13 through 15 what I'm just going to call the deluded brother. Verses 13 through 15, the deluded brother. Verses 16 through 20, you'll have the foolish miser. The foolish miser, 16 through 20. And then in verse 21, we'll conclude with the deceived man. The deceived man. So the deluded brother, 13 through 15. The foolish miser, 16 through 20. In verse 21, the deceived man. Notice how this begins here in verse 13. And verses 13 through 15 is simply the setting that sets up the parable for us in 16 through 20. But in verse 13, notice first of all that a man comes to Jesus from the crowd, and he says to him these words. He says, "And teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." Now this is the issue. This is what sets everything up. And understand, it was not uncommon in this day for a person to come and ask the local rabbi to weigh in on issues of familial matters. In fact, I have on a number of occasions been asked to give counsel into situations involving family issues, finances, investments, property, inheritances, things of that nature. It was no different in this day. But the key here to understand is that this man, notice, was not actually seeking counsel, was he? This is not asking for counsel. Rather, notice he comes to Jesus and issues him a demand. He is not asking for Jesus' perspective. Rather, he is demanding of Jesus, hoping to leverage the spiritual authority. What is Jesus' response? Verse 14, he says, "And man, who has appointed me a judge or arbiter over you?" In other words, true to Jesus, he just completely avoids the stated issue, the presenting issue, and gets to the deeper heart issue. In fact, the longer you pastor, or the longer that you're involved in ministry, frankly, anyway, the more you realize that there is always the presenting issue, but then there is always the deeper heart issue. What people come to you about is rarely the actual issue, even if they don't know it. And so here Jesus refuses to get caught up in such temporary or material issues that to him, frankly, just smells of a heart that is consumed by greed, as we're about to see. In fact, notice he addresses him here in verse 14 as a mere man, or you could just translate it as, "Oh man." In other words, he's coming to him about some material or temporary triviality, but with no view of eternity in mind. That is Jesus' perspective. And so Jesus addresses him with a very creaturely term, again, man, but because he's about to remind him of his fleeting nature. That is why he does that. In fact, Jesus has been instructing on some very profound issues of spirituality, issues of eternity. He's been speaking on issues of judgment to come, but all that this man can think about is getting his share of some temporary inheritance. In other words, again, in the grand scheme of eternity, this is a very petty issue. This is temporary, interpersonal. And Jesus refuses to even enter into it. And because this man, he understands, is consumed by something corrupt. And what is it that is driving such a demand? Well, on the surface, this seems to be an issue of justice, an issue of equity, an issue of equality, right? This man, in his own mind, has a right to be angry. He is justified in his anger. And so Jesus says, beware. Beware. This man, in his own mind, has a right to demand justice, a right to demand equality, fair treatment. And because, again, after all, is not justice an issue of God? He's justified in his anger. Well, Jesus, notice here, would be accused in our day of his silence being violence, because he understands that in the demand for equality, well, of course, always packaged in terms of justice, is actually just an issue of greed, covetousness. In fact, notice verse 15. He makes that explicit. Here's what is driving this man and consuming his heart. He says, verse 15, and beware and be on your guard. Two very strong verbs doubled up to emphasize the point. Written here in what's known as the imperative mood, which, as you know by now, means that these are two overt commands. He says, beware and be on guard against every form of greed. That is what this is. This is about a greedy heart. In fact, this word here, beware, is literally to see or to watch out. It's the idea of opening up your eyes, but to your own blindnesses. He says to this man, you don't understand the gravity of your words. You don't understand the gravity of the situation. Like, you've been duped for some reason into believing that this is an issue of justice, but this is an issue of a corrupt heart with faulty motives. That is what is driving you. That is what is motivating your outrage. And so he says, beware. But then he says, notice, to be on guard, written in the active voice, present tense. In other words, this is something that you yourself must do. And it must be continuous, in process. Again, present tense, ongoing state. In other words, the death of the soul, or in the context here, as we're going to see, a loss of reward when you get to heaven, is found in passivity. In fact, the issue of something like money is one of those issues in the Christian life that we get convicted about, and so we'll do a self-examination. Maybe we'll think we're okay. Maybe we need to do a little bit better. Maybe we'll cut a check or something to the church to ease the conviction. But then the reality is that we just sort of move on, right? Check that box. That is what we do if we're honest. But the problem is that in our moving on, we become passive, and in our passivity, we fall right back into the sin and faulty motive. And why? Well, because the default of the human heart is blindness, deception, and wickedness. And so what do you have to do to be in a bad spot in terms of your Christian life? All you have to do is literally nothing. Just literally do nothing, and you'll naturally default back into wickedness, because the sin nature is what abides. And so if you don't stand on guard, Jesus says, against the greed or against the deception, perhaps that is in your own heart, then you will float by default always into covetousness in this case. In fact, notice the object of what we're to watch out for or be on guard against, as he says. He says, notice, every form, so this is something that is apparently multifaceted. This is a variegated issue. It is subtle. It is deceptive. It is unbelievably creeping. It's not just so obvious, in other words, which is why we're commanded to watch out and be on intense proactive guard. But watch out and be on guard against every form of greed. Some translations will translate greed here with the word covetousness, which is a fine translation. And the question to ask, though, is what does that word mean? What does it mean in the original? Well, it's the word pleion exia, which means to have literally a strong inward desire, but irrespective of need. A strong desire, but irrespective of need, which means then the desire in and of itself, hear this, the desire in and of itself is not necessarily bad. Just having a desire is neutral. There's nothing inherently moral about desires unless it's a desire for something overtly sinful. And so it's not so much the desire here that is the issue, but rather the issue comes in when the desire is weighed up and against the reality as to whether or not it's a true need. And remember, in the context, he is preparing his disciples for a life of faithfulness, a life of fruitfulness, a life of mission. And so what is the need? Well, the need is anything required in order to remain faithful to Christ in the expansion of the kingdom. And so how does the term then work itself out in this passage? Well, it's a command to be on guard against a strong desire for anything unnecessary for faithfulness to Christ. Now, notice he's not saying anywhere here that you shouldn't have something. Rather, he is just saying be on guard as to why you want something. In other words, examine the motive. What is the driving motive? What is the attitude? In fact, the term greed here, it's actually bound up with the sin of dissatisfaction, discontentment. It's not saying that I'm going to pursue this because I want to honor the Lord and this is how I can do it. Rather, it's saying I'm going to pursue this because I'm believing that this is what will satisfy me personally. It's going to fill the craving, or as he'll say later, it's going to make my soul merry as an end in and of itself. In fact, the sense of the term is the idea of pursuing something, but believing that you're owed it. In fact, that was exactly what is going on with this man here in verse 13. It's believing that you're owed something, despite the fact, again, the Bible says over and over again, the only thing that all of us are owed is judgment. It's that cultural mantra that you'll see literally pasted on billboards as you're driving down the interstate. It's like a picture of Starbucks or something, and it says, go and get it because you deserve it. It's terrible thinking from a biblical perspective. And so Jesus here warns that you must look intensely and be on guard against that kind of attitude of the heart. And why? Why should you be on guard? Second half of verse 15, here it is. For life, remember the word for gives a reason. For life, he says, does not consist in the abundance of possessions. It's the idea of finding identity or fulfillment or ultimate satisfaction in some kind of temporary pursuit. A relationship, money, stuff, achievements, a career. In fact, how many have their identity bound up in what they do, their career, their hobby, their craft, whatever. For them, all of that literally is life. That is where they're believing meaning to be found. That is where identity is. It's an attitude that says that once I can get it, then I'll be really alive. I'll be really living. Which, by the way, perfectly explains then why when a person is stripped of it, whatever it is, again, money, hobby, career, relationship, but when they're stripped of it or they never actually attain it, it sends them into some kind of spiral. Anxiety, depression, worry, lack of fulfillment, lack of contentment, lack of meaning, some cases suicide. And why? Well, because whether they admit it or not, that is what they have come to believe is life. And they don't have it. And so if they don't have it, then life is not worth living because they no longer have that which they're believing constitutes life. In fact, how many gain a sense of meaning and pride merely because they've achieved a certain status or have developed a skill or have attained something? They've hit a certain pay grade. They've gotten a certain level of acreage. Finally been able to build that square footage of house, whatever. And so now they feel like they're really living. Jesus' instruction here is to watch out. Be on guard against that kind of thinking. Be intensely suspicious of your motives. And not merely because of what the writer of Ecclesiastes says, where once you get what your soul is craving, it always just slips between the fingers like sand. You know what this is. Never actually satisfies, and so you hop from one pursuit to the next, hoping, thinking, and feeling like this next pursuit will be that thing that will finally satisfy the soul just for it to once again fail. But more importantly, as followers of Christ, you have been handed the baton of Jesus' mission. And so do not simply assume that what you have or what you're pursuing is actually holy in terms of building the kingdom. That is the essence of this warning. And it's important because of the parable that he now gives. So again, that's the deluded brother. That's what sets this up. Jesus says, you don't understand. You are deluded into believing a lie. He's been deluded into thinking that he's owed something or that he's found the way to experiencing the fullness of life. And so in verses 16 through 20, we now see Jesus illustrate the reason for this command with his very famous parable. And so notice what he says in verse 16. He says these words. He says, and he, Jesus, told them a parable, saying, the land of a rich man was very productive, fruitful. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, so what shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? And he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grains and my goods. He's got a plan. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come, so take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. Now here is the picture of a foolish miser. This is the quintessential moralist. This is one who's been blinded by the fleeting pursuits of the here and the now. And so this is a man who operates with reference to self. That is the issue. In fact, just notice some of the details of this. Notice, first of all, verse 16. Jesus says that the land of this rich man was very productive. The land of this rich man was very productive. The term here for land is the word korah. It means literally to have some extensive holdings. In fact, you could translate it here as a countryside or literally a very large region of land. In other words, the very thing that many people dream of. And understand that this is not a farmer or something like that in the sense of that this is what he does for a living. This is not his trade. In fact, notice he is not identified here as a farmer, but a rich man. And so he's just a very wealthy person. He has extensive holdings. In other words, he is self-sufficient. This is the idea. He's got some property. He can grow his own produce, his own food, his own resources. He's escaped the hubbub of the city, and he has set himself up pretty nicely. And he's done it all for the purpose, this is the point, for the purpose of securing his future. Retirement. Notice verse 19. So that he might take his ease, worry-free living, comfort, security, all the way into his final days where he can finally come into the fullness of life. Now, what's important to observe with verse 16 is that notice Jesus says that the land of this rich man was very productive. So it's not that the man was very productive, but rather notice the land of this man was very productive. That is the observation to make. In other words, this man may have worked himself to the bone in terms of input, or in other words, the very opposite of whatever taking his ease will be here in verse 19. But the fruitfulness or the product of his labor is something that is bound up in the hand of God. In fact, that is just a very basic biblical truth. Any farmer, whether they're a Christian or not, understands that. It is why, in fact, when a person boasts in anything about themselves or their discipline or the produce of their labors or their work ethic or any God-given skill, it is so unbelievably wicked. And because what do you have that has not been utterly given to you? Anything that you have or that has been produced by the labor of your hands is always a gift of God. Paul puts it this way, 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 7. He says, what do you have that you did not receive? And since you did receive it, why do you boast as if you have not received it? And so this man's field, in the divine providence and frankly mercy of God, yielded a tremendous produce. This was a bumper crop. This man's wealth literally grew before him. And it's not like there's anything particularly special about this man, that God should show him this kind of favor, that he should receive this in any way. Again, this was just a pure gift. That's the way it's framed out here. And so in the providence of God's sovereignty, he allowed the field of this man to yield this produce. And any of these Jews whom Jesus is talking to would have understood this. That is their worldview. And so notice then what this man in the parable does immediately. And this is exactly what we do if we're honest, verse 17. So the crop comes in, which means, of course, he's now even more wealthy. The riches are just overflowing. What does he do? Verse 17. Well, Jesus says, notice, and he began reasoning to himself. It's a term, dialogizomai, from which we get dialogue. He literally starts dialoguing within himself. We know what this is. You get word of a pay raise. Maybe you're just anticipating some kind of pay raise. What is the first thing that you do? Well, you begin to reason within yourself as to what you're going to do with it, right? Where should it go? What can I get? I'm a good steward. How should I invest it? What can I buy with it? It's the idea here of a back and forth within himself as to how to keep it, how to grow it, how to secure it, or how to maximize it. How to gain something with it. And so notice the immediate instinct of this internal conversation. He asks himself, so what shall I do since I have no place to store my crops? What a predicament. Now, presumably, this man lives in Israel. That is the typical setting of Jesus' parables. And so no doubt this man would have understood the nature of the law. And yet notice here there is absolutely zero thought of sacrifice, no thought of the poor, no thought of making an offering to God, no thought of the temple, no thought of the synagogue, no thought of why perhaps God has enriched him in the first place. Rather, his immediate instinct goes to storage. It goes to surplus. It goes to protecting and securitizing the gain. He's already got more than enough, plenty to live on, but he is unbelievably rich, and now he's even richer, and yet his only thought is to use it as an opportunity to just get a little bit more ahead. Again, we know what this is. And what you should know about this parable is that in just 3 verses, there are literally 15 references to self by this man. 15 references to self. That is what makes it so indicting. In fact, notice there's 5 alone just in verse 17. Jesus says, and he began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do since I have no place to store my crops? In fact, that final one there is perhaps the worst of all because he's actually believing that what God has gifted to him is actually his. That is what makes it so wicked. He says, where shall I store my crops? So what is his conclusion? Believing that his surplus is actually his to spend on self in the pursuit of pleasure and life and ease. Verse 18, this is what I will do. Notice the confidence. This is a declaration. He has made a decision. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and all my goods. So not just his crops, but apparently also what the sale of some of these crops are going to now allow him to buy for himself. And what you have to recognize about this man is that we would call this man wise, right? This is a wise man. This man dialogizomai. He dialogued, reasoned, employed wisdom to secure his future. Again, a faithful steward. It's not like he just trifled it away on some immediate pleasure. Perhaps the market of grain would go up in the future, so let's store it away to be able to sell it for a higher price. Couldn't immediately sell it because he'd flood the market and actually drop the price of grain, so let's store it away. We'll slowly release it as the demand increases. Again, control the supply. You'll yield for yourself a higher price. Basic economics. This was a financially savvy decision. This man in his wisdom knew exactly what he was doing. Wise stewardship. After all, does not the Bible tell us even to invest? Invest well, invest wisely? But this has nothing to do with that. This is about motive. This is about loves. This is about real living. In fact, we know that because of verse 19, where notice, he says, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. This is security. This is comfort. This is worry-free living with a massive safety net. a storehouse of wealth where I'll never have to fret about the future again. And why is that important? Well, notice the motive. It'll result in his ability to take his ease, to eat, to drink, to be merry. This is, in other words, about self. It's about self. In fact, I could preach a whole sermon on just that verse alone as to the incredible folly as to how most people think about something like retirement and investments and their approach to retirement, storing up with the 401ks, all the Roth IRAs, whatever. Assuming that it's going to be there, or assuming that they're actually going to be alive to really live and enjoy it. Is that to say you shouldn't do that? No. As we'll see, this is about attitude. This language here of soul is so important. That is key, because again, it carries undertones of that which constitutes life. Again, what we're really believing is real living. Every single one of us knows that feeling of coming into something, and there's just that declaring to the soul, right? A feeling of true comfort, true security, ambition, the prospect of what this could produce. In fact, this term here of merry, it's very interesting. It's the word euphrino, from which we get the word euphoria. You and I both know that there's just a euphoria to the soul. There's an elation to the soul. In fact, some of you have come into some very serious money. And when you first heard of it, there was almost a physical buzzing within you, right? You know what this is. The endorphins hit high. Why? Because of all the potential. Because of what this could mean. You entered into a literal high because of the prospect of how this might mean truly living for you. The fullness of life. All you might be able to do. All the security that this might finally provide. No more worries, no more anxiety, no more fear. And so this man was wise. He was smart financially. He was clever. He was prudent. He was judicious in order to maximize and securitize the gain. But verse 20, notice God's perspective. This man may have dialogued and reasoned within his soul from a place of earthly wisdom to invest his surplus well. But verse 20, but God said to him, you fool. Notice the contrast. But God said to him, you fool. Why? For this very night your soul, there's that term again. He thought his soul would be at ease, verse 19. But God said, your soul is required of you. And who will own what you have prepared? Now, words almost fail to describe the magnitude of this verse in terms of importance for your life. This term translated here as required, where he says that your soul is required of you, that is actually a legal term in reference to calling back a loan. If you can understand the imagery here of this, it might literally change your life and your perspective. Fundamental problem of this man's thinking is that he was thinking that his life was actually his. That is the issue. That is the great error of most people in this world, and frankly, that is the great error of many Christians. There is something within the heart that causes us to believe by our own short-sighted perspective that God has given to us life or a soul, but for the purpose of self. That is the perspective of a fool when put up and against the prospect of eternity. And because when you're actually believing that your life is really yours, it has a fundamental way of determining literally every decision that you make. And if that is your perspective, then every decision, according to Jesus, will be one of eternal folly. Because what you believe about the future is seen in how you make the decisions in the now. Some of you are working so hard to the bone for everything that is going away. More upgrades, stuff, bigger property, more security, more comfort, more ease, longer vacations. But what is the beginning of true wisdom? It is to fear God, right? Proverbs 9 and verse 10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. What is wisdom? It is one who makes every decision in life with reference to God. Mark of a wise person is one who makes every decision with reference to God because they understand that their soul has been put on loan to them by their maker and judge, and a day is coming in which he's going to require it back from you. And the issue in that hour will be, hear me, it will be, how did you invest your life? How did you spend your soul? What did you do with what God gave you? The idea here is one of a true stewardship. Similar to the idea of, or the parable of the talents, where Jesus talks about a master who gives to his slaves some talents. Some invested well and wisely, others did literally nothing with it. But what was the point of the parable? The point was that the master was coming back, right? He was coming back. And when he came back, he expected a return. What is the definition of a fool in this passage? It is one who lives their life assuming that tomorrow has been promised to them. And that if tomorrow does come, that it's actually been given to them for them. Foolish decision, as far as God is concerned, is making safe and worldly wise decisions because you assume it's going to do something for you for tomorrow in this life. Despite the fact tomorrow's been promised to nobody. Again, what is the cause of anxiety? Anxiety is a foolish emotion. That's what it is. It is a foolish emotion driven by fear over some unknown about tomorrow. Anxiety is a foolish emotion driven by fear over some unknown of tomorrow. And so we think that if we can just secure tomorrow and we can set aside the nest egg and we can get all of our ducks in a perfect row, then we can live anxiety-free today because tomorrow's been guaranteed. That's what we think. You want to know what a truly wise person is? Wise person is someone who experiences an anxiety of the soul, but because they live in a perpetual state of fear that perhaps they're wasting their life before God. That is wisdom. That is a holy anxiety. And because they're just that convinced that everything about this life has everything to do with eternity. Has to do with God. In fact, just sort through all those items that keep you awake at night and have you flopping back and forth on your bed like a hinged door, as the Proverbs describes. How many of your anxiety-ridden thoughts are the result of a deep concern in your soul as to how you can maximize your heavenly reward in the glory of God? How many sleepless nights do you have because you're wrestling with how to use the money that God has gifted to you for the cause of the kingdom? How many of you lay awake at night strategizing how to get more money because your motive is to earn as much as you can, but so that you might give it away? How many of you are sleepless because you're anxious over how to most helpfully come alongside your brothers and sisters in Christ, using your time, talents, and money to build them up and edify the body? How many of you have sleepless nights because you spend your nights figuring out how to make a decision with your time and money that to a watching world looks like folly, because to them it would only mean loss. Because they have no concern over the glory of God or the expansion of the kingdom, and zero idea as to why they've been gifted life and resources in the first place. Most Christians don't lay awake at night because of that. Most aren't trying to figure out how to get more because of that. Most people strategize, and I say this in love because Jesus is the one saying it, not me. Most people strategize because they're misers or squanders. Pleasure, comfort, security, ease, getting ahead, that is the motive. But Jesus says it is folly. That is not living life with an eternal perspective. That is forgetting why he allows a person to be enriched in the first place, something we're going to talk about next time. In fact, notice verse 21. Here's the deceived man. Self-deception is so destructive. Told you this was going to be a happy sermon. Jesus says that the miser in this parable makes a parallel and application. He says, so is the man, talking about the Christian. Remember, this is a lesson for his disciples. So is the man who stores up treasure for himself, and implied there here on earth, but is not rich toward God. We're going to talk next time about storing up treasure for yourself in heaven, which is a very profound and important principle and life-altering, frankly, if you can understand it. But the mark of one who is deeply deceived is one who actually thinks that the pursuit of anything in this world will give to him true life. That is deception. Some of you right now are looking at some kind of decision. Could be a small one, could be a big one. I don't know what it is, but I know that you do. It's a decision involving a relationship. It's involving a career, a school, finances, property. Specifics don't really matter because it's not really about the issue. Rather, it's about the motive. And I'd venture to say that you probably already know exactly what you should do. I think you do. The only thing you're wrestling with is fear over what you might lose in the here and the now. And so you're negotiating as to how you can still keep it. That's what you're doing. Or how to get it. How you can keep the pleasure or attain the security or attain the comfort that thing or decision will bring, but all the while justifying it in some way that it's actually something you're doing for eternity. Do not be deceived. In fact, the better taught that you are and the better you know the Bible, then the more skilled you are at using the Bible to escape the Bible. Come on, I've been a pastor long enough. I've known my own heart long enough. We can justify the pursuit of just about anything under the guise that this is somehow in service to God. Which again, by the way, is why he piles on the doubling of the verbs to beware and to stand guard. In fact, you're a wise person if you assume that you're actually blind to something and not standing guard. That's the better default, as opposed to just justifying it under the guise of something holy. Let me just reiterate again, this is not actually a passage about money. It's not about how much you have. It's not about material stuff. In fact, next week you're going to hear me say that I think that you should make as much money as you possibly can, but so that you might give it away or use it in service to God in a righteous way. But understand that the more that you have, the more responsibility you have before your Maker. You just do. The more he'll require of you. Question next time will be, so why has God enriched you in the first place? Is it actually to spend on self, or is it to invest in the kingdom? And the answer to that question might actually surprise you, because they're not actually mutually exclusive categories. But the question for this morning is not why has God enriched you. The question for this morning is why has God given to you life? The key word in this passage is soul. Something much more profound. I want you to know as your pastor that I want your life to count, because I'm going to have to give an account for you. So maybe it's selfish. I want your life to matter in terms of what you did for the kingdom because of what it'll earn for you in terms of eternity. And again, we're not talking here at all about salvation, which comes only through the finished work of Christ on the cross. There's nothing you can do to attain salvation or enter heaven. It comes by faith alone in what Christ alone has done for you. It's not what this is about. This is a lesson for those of you who already are Christians. This is a conversation about the depth of your heavenly reward. And because every decision you make in the now has a direct impact on your usefulness for the kingdom, and therefore what is to come for you when eternity enters. There will be reward in heaven, understand. But the level of that reward is directly connected to what you choose to do in the here and the now. And some people nullify their usefulness to the kingdom because of a foolish decision. A person came into money, but they squandered it on self, and now they have nothing. A person came into money, but because they love comfort and security, which is always false, by the way, because we live in a fallen and broken world and everything disappoints. But they came into money, and because they love security, they refuse to do anything with it but watch the number in their bank account just keep growing. Person lusted for a relationship, and so they married a fool, which in turn limited them in their usefulness to Christ. There are many ways the principle here works itself out, but the question really becomes, and this is it, so what are you living for? What is the question? What are you living for? And make no mistake, you can have what your heart at times desires for now, but it'll be fleeting, limited, and failing, and ridden with worry, because it belongs to this age. And I promise you, it will bring to you nothing but anxiety, worry. Or you can live in light of everything still to come and give it away and take a risk, trusting the Lord because you're so controlled by an eternal perspective. And so what is it that drives you? What is it that controls literally every decision of your life? Is it the glory of God and understanding that it comes with eternal reward for you? Or is it safety, comfort, and stuff, and the assumption that tomorrow is actually yours to have? Some of you spend so many thoughts and all of your desires and so many hours and so much money on everything that is utterly going away. It's going away. And you're forgetting the old adage that no hearse pulls a U-Haul. Day is coming in which God is going to require back his loan on your life that he gave you for the purpose of investing in eternity, investing in the cause of the kingdom and the spread of the gospel. And so what is it right now that is actually causing you to trust God for something? Because again, what you most sacrifice for reveals what you most love and what you're trusting in. That for which you're willing to take the biggest risk always reveals your greatest love. Christians are really good in serving, and at serving and making even apparently radical decisions for the sake of Christ, but only from a position of profound security, right? After all the ducks are in a row, after they put a certain amount of wheat into the barn. But if it's not really sacrifice, the question is it really worship? I want you to think about that principle as we go into next time, because we're going to talk about it again. There's a very good reason for why many acts of worship that God commanded of Israel in the Old Testament were built on a system of sacrifice, literally called the sacrificial system of worship. Their acts of worship literally cost them something. God was never impressed when someone gave him the gimpy goat that nobody really wanted anyway. It's just a pain. Let's just get rid of it. But it pleased him much when they sacrificed the choice of their fold, gave on the first day of the week, gave from the first fruits of their crops. And why? Well, because it required trust, sacrifice, and an eternal perspective. No wonder why Paul says in Romans 12, picking up on that imagery of the Old Testament, he says that the true spiritual service of worship is a life that is offered up as a living and holy sacrifice. That is your true spiritual service of worship, he says. For God to be worshiped, it implies sacrifice. And God doesn't need our stuff. That's not the point. He owns everything in the universe already anyway. What he delights in is sacrifice flowing from a heart of trust, joy, and thanksgiving. And we're going to talk about that next time. I know I'm going over, but this is important. Give me a few minutes. I'm not certain you can preach on this passage actually without quoting that 19th century poet C.T. Studd, who of course captured the essence of this very text so well. It's a longer poem, but let me give you the final refrain that many of you know well. He said in those famous words that only one life will soon be past, only what is done for Christ, finish it, will last. And why? Because everything else is going away. Every pursuit, every accomplishment, every last penny will utterly disappear on you. And only what you have done for Christ will matter. And so when I am dying, he says, how happy I'll be if the lamp of my life has been burned out, but for thee. A man is no wiser than when he is laying on his deathbed because he has a proper perspective. For the Christian, there's only one thing that will make you happy in that final hour, and I promise you it will have nothing to do with what you did or what you accomplished, but everything to do with what you're about to inherit. It is a wise person who lives every single day of their life as though it were their last. For then you'll be living with a certain perspective. What is the actual message of this passage? God has given to every single one of you a soul, but to spend well and become exhausted for the sake of Christ. That is why you've been given life. Not only is every soul on loan to the creature required back by its maker, again, far sooner than any of us like to think about, but how much more for the Christian whose soul has been purchased with a price. 1 Corinthians 6:20, for you have been bought with a price, therefore glorify God. Live for him. Everything you've pursued and spent your life for in terms of temporary stuff is going to be inherited by another. Jesus' very point in verse 19. And if you know Ecclesiastes, it's going to be inherited probably by a fool. So why become worldly wise just for a fool to spend on their own pleasures? The reality is that probably all of you are going to die with money still in your bank account, as long as China doesn't get its way. So why not invest it on something eternal? And then have that perspective about your life, all of your pursuits, goals, and efforts. Why labor for the bread that perishes, Jesus asks? Would you not rather weary your soul exhausted for the sake of Christ? So what are you living for? That is the question. Again, these are words of Jesus to his disciples, not about evangelism or salvation, but mission and reward. The call of this passage is to understand that the number on your days has been set. The psalmist cries out to God in 90 and verse 12 of the Psalms. He says, "So teach us to number our days, that we might present to you a heart of wisdom," a life of worship. Life is fleeting. The one thing you'll never be able to get back, beloved, is the gift of time. So spend it well and invest it in Christ.